Remember when Canadian restaurants weren't just places to eat, they were landmarks? When every town had that one spot where the food was questionable, the service was slow, but somehow you kept going back anyway? The 1970s gave us some legendary Canadian restaurants, but let's be honest, not all of them deserve to survive. Some faded into history for very good reasons. Hit that subscribe button now because number 1 on this list is going to shock you with how bad it actually was. Restaurant number 20, Smitty's Pancake House. Early years. Starting at number 20, Smitty's Pancake House in its early incarnation was rough around the edges when it launched in the late 60s. Before Smitty's became the polished chain we know today, those first locations in BC were struggling to find their identity. The pancakes were inconsistent, sometimes fluffy, sometimes dense as hockey pucks. The coffee was weak, the service was painfully slow, and the decor screamed, "We're trying too hard to be American." What saved Smitty's was learning from mistakes and completely overhauling operations by the 80s. But those early years, forgettable at best. Restaurant number 19, Chicken Delight. At 19, Chicken Delight promised home delivery of fried chicken before it was common, but the execution was disastrous. The chicken arrived lukewarm at best, soggy from sitting in cardboard boxes during delivery. The coating would slide off in greasy sheets. And the delivery times? You'd order at 6, maybe get your food by 8, if you were lucky. The slogan, "Don't cook tonight, call Chicken Delight," should have been, "Don't call tonight, you'll regret it." Most locations closed by the mid-70s when customers realized KFC was just better. Restaurant number 18, York Steakhouse. Number 18 brings us York Steakhouse, the American import that tried to crack the Canadian market in the 70s and failed spectacularly. The concept was budget steaks with a salad bar, but the steaks were tough as leather, and the salad bar featured wilted lettuce and suspicious-looking potato salad. The restaurants were always freezing cold, the service was indifferent, and the whole experience felt like eating in a cafeteria. Canadian locations closed quickly when locals realized Ponderosa offered the same concept, but actually edible food. Restaurant number 17, International House of Pancakes, early Canadian locations. At 17, IHOP's first Canadian locations in the 70s were disasters that gave the chain a bad reputation. It took decades to overcome. The pancakes were gummy, the syrup was watered down, and the international menu was just regular breakfast with confusing names. The service was slow, the coffee was terrible, and the prices were higher than local diners that served better food. Most early Canadian IHOPs closed within a few years, and it wasn't until the 2000s that the chain successfully returned. Restaurant number 16, Steak and Burger. Number 16, Steak and Burger, the Ontario chain that couldn't decide what it wanted to be and failed at both. The steaks were thin, overcooked, and flavorless. The burgers were dry and served on stale buns. The fries were either undercooked or burnt, never in between. And the prices were too high for the quality you got. The restaurants tried to be upscale but looked cheap. They tried to be family-friendly, but the atmosphere was cold and unwelcoming. By the early 80s, they'd all closed, unmourned. Restaurant number 15, Red Barn. At 15, Red Barn, the American fast food chain that briefly invaded Canada in the 70s with barn-shaped buildings and forgettable food. The burgers were bland, the chicken was dry, and the Big Barney sandwich was just a poor man's Big Mac. The novelty of eating in a building shaped like a barn wore off after one visit when you realized the food wasn't worth the drive. Canadian locations closed rapidly when customers chose McDonald's or Harvey's instead. Restaurant number 14, Junior's Restaurant. Number 14, Junior's Restaurant, the Toronto area chain that served oversized portions of underseasoned food in depressing dining rooms. Everything was beige, the walls, the food, the atmosphere. The menu was massive, but nothing was done well. The service was slow, the coffee was weak, and the whole experience felt like eating in a hospital cafeteria. The chain limped through the 70s before closing in the early 80s, remembered only for being aggressively mediocre. Restaurant number 13, Golden Griddle, early locations. At 13, Golden Griddle's early locations were rough before the chain found its footing in the 80s. The pancakes were gummy, the eggs were overcooked, and the bacon was either raw or burnt. The service was indifferent, the coffee was terrible, and the prices were too high for breakfast food that wasn't as good as what your mom made. Later locations improved dramatically, but those first Golden Griddles in the early 70s, skip them. Restaurant number 12, Tastee-Freez. Number 12, Tastee-Freez, the soft-serve chain that tried to be a full restaurant and failed miserably. The ice cream was fine, but the burgers were awful, the hot dogs were worse, and the fries were consistently soggy. The restaurants were always dirty, the service was slow, and the whole operation felt like it was run by teenagers who didn't care. Most Canadian locations closed by the late 70s when customers realized they could get better ice cream and better food elsewhere. Restaurant number 11, Sandies. At 11, Sandies, the American burger chain that briefly operated in Canada with a Scottish theme that made no sense and food that was worse. The burgers were small, dry, and flavorless, the fries were limp, the milkshakes were thin, and the Scottish theme, complete with tartan decor and bagpipe music, was baffling in a burger joint. Canadian locations closed quickly, and the chain was eventually absorbed by Hardee's, which never came to Canada. Good riddance. Restaurant number 10, Burger Chef, Canadian locations. Number 10, Burger Chef's Canadian locations were disasters that tarnished what was actually a decent American chain. The Canadian franchises were poorly managed, with inconsistent food quality, dirty restaurants, and terrible service. The Works Bar, where you could customize your burger, was often out of toppings. The fries were cold. The staff was surly. While American burger chefs were fine, the Canadian ones were so bad they all closed by the late 70s. Restaurant number 9, Henry's Hamburgers. At 9, Henry's Hamburgers, another American import that failed to understand the Canadian market. The burgers were tiny, the prices were too high, and the restaurants were always cold. The service was slow, the food was mediocre, and there was nothing that made Henry's better than Harvey's or McDonald's. Canadian locations closed within a few years, and most Canadians never even knew they existed. Restaurant number 8, Lums. Number 8, Lums, famous for beer-steamed hot dogs that sounded interesting but tasted terrible. The hot dogs were mushy from being steamed in beer, the buns were soggy, and the whole thing was a mess to eat. The burgers weren't any better. The restaurants were dark and depressing, and the beer-steaming gimmick couldn't overcome fundamentally bad food. Canadian locations closed in the mid-70s, and nobody missed them. Restaurant number 7, Burger Queen/Druthers. At 7, Burger Queen, which became Druthers, a chain that couldn't figure out its identity and served mediocre food under multiple names. The burgers were forgettable, the fried chicken was dry, and the salad bar was sad. The constant rebranding confused customers, and the food quality never improved enough to build loyalty. Canadian locations were gone by the early 80s, victims of their own inconsistency. Restaurant number 6, Wetson's. Number 6, Wetson's. The New York chain that briefly crossed into Ontario with burgers so bad they became legendary for the wrong reasons. The burgers were thin, greasy, and flavorless. The buns disintegrated in your hands. The fries were always cold, and the restaurant smelled like old grease and disappointment. Ontario locations closed within months, and Wetson's became a cautionary tale about American chains that shouldn't have crossed the border. Restaurant number 5, Carrols. At 5, Carrols, another American burger chain that invaded Canada in the 70s and immediately regretted it. The burgers were terrible, the service was worse, and the restaurants were always dirty. The club burger was just a regular burger with an extra bun slice in the middle, adding nothing but confusion. Canadian locations closed rapidly, and Carrols retreated back to the U.S. where they eventually became Burger King franchises. Restaurant number 4, Gino's Hamburgers. Number 4, Gino's Hamburgers, the chain that tried to compete with McDonald's and failed in every possible way. The burgers were dry, the fries were soggy, and the fried chicken was somehow worse than both. The restaurants were poorly maintained, the service was terrible, and the prices were too high for the quality. Canadian locations closed in the mid-70s, and the chain eventually died completely in the US too. Restaurant number 3, Burger King, early Canadian locations. At 3, and this might surprise you, but Burger King's first Canadian locations in the early 70s were absolutely terrible. The Whoppers were cold, the fries were limp, and the service was so slow you'd age waiting for your order. The restaurants were dirty, poorly managed, and gave the chain a reputation it took years to overcome. It wasn't until the late 70s and 80s that Burger King figured out the Canadian market. Those first locations, disasters that nearly killed the brand here. Restaurant number 2, White Tower. Coming in at number 2, White Tower, the White Castle knockoff that served tiny, terrible burgers in depressing restaurants. The burgers were small, greasy, and tasted like cardboard. The restaurants were always dirty, the service was non-existent, and the whole experience felt like punishment. The chain tried to copy White Castle's success, but failed to copy the one thing that mattered: decent food. Canadian locations closed in the early 70s, and White Tower became a footnote in fast food history. Restaurant number 1, Sandies Drive-In, unrelated to Sandies Burgers. And here we are at number 1, Sandies Drive-In, the small Canadian chain that was so spectacularly bad it became legendary. Operating in southern Ontario in the early 70s, Sandies Drive-In served food that was barely edible. The burgers were gray, the fries were raw in the middle, and the milkshakes were just milk with food coloring. The service was hostile, the restaurants were filthy, and health inspectors were regular visitors. What made Sandies Drive-In the worst wasn't just the terrible food, it was the complete indifference to customer satisfaction. Staff were rude, orders were wrong, and complaints were ignored. The restaurant smelled like grease and despair. One location in Hamilton was famous for a sign that read, "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone," which they exercised liberally, kicking out customers who complained about the food. Sandies Drive-In locations closed by 1974, shut down by health departments, and abandoned by customers who'd finally had enough. For those who remember, Sandies represents the absolute bottom of 70s Canadian dining. There you have it, 20 Canadian restaurants from the 70s that faded into history for very good reasons. Not every restaurant deserves to be remembered fondly, and these 20 proved that nostalgia has its limits. Which one do you remember? Did you actually eat at any of these disasters? Drop your horror stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this trip through Canadian restaurant failures, hit that subscribe button, because next week we're covering the best Canadian restaurants from the 70s that we actually miss. Thanks for watching, and remember, not everything from the past was better.